innovation imperative. Now, survival isn't compulsory. Take Kodak, a great business for much of the 20th century, founded by a really smart entrepreneur, George Eastman, way back in 1888, and yet today in big trouble. Or Sears, a household name in retailing in the United States, and yet, despite again successful entrepreneurs in its founding days, in trouble, Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Or Blockbuster, for many years a business built on the way we consume video, offering rentals on discs and tapes, but pushed out of the way now by players like Netflix. Or Pan Am, one of the great airlines as we saw, now disappeared. Or Nokia, still alive, still thriving, but the part of it that makes the networks, the bit that made the phones, that gave the brand such recognition, disappeared. And Polaroid, Edwin Land, another great entrepreneur, inventor, who'd already put many good innovations into practice, eventually coming up with the instant film, the instant photography concept, which eventually became a challenge for Kodak. But now Polaroid too, Chapter 11 bankruptcy. We could go on, but the message is very clear. Survival is not compulsory. And that's even more of a challenge for the startup. This simple curve shows that companies that get as far as getting funding, what's called the pre-series or Series A funding, very few of them survive in the long term. And behind them are the many, many casualties who didn't make it that far. Innovation is difficult. So we really, when we talk about survival and growth, need to remember Charles Darwin. We met him earlier, and his saying in his book is really relevant here. He basically said it's not the strongest of the species nor the most intelligent, it's the one that's most adaptable to change which is going to survive. Part of that story is that big is not necessarily best. Dinosaurs were, after all, quite big, and we have plenty of examples in the business world of big companies who grew from startups but became big, but eventually their size didn't help them to survive. And that's probably true of all those examples we gave a moment ago. It's also not about big brains. If we think in the company world, the kind of organization that invests in research, we'd think would have a good chance in innovation. That's true, but it's not enough. One of the biggest names in R&D spending for many years was IBM. Indeed, one of the biggest names in the computer industry overall. Good at technical research, also very good at market research. But despite being a household name in the 1980s, they ran into serious trouble. They had to undergo a radical change to pull them around. It was a matter of life and death, a survival challenge. So the key really is adapting to a changing world. A bit like the chameleon, who doesn't just have this capacity to change, but does it in response to a changing environment. Now, let's be a little more positive. It's not just about companies that grow and then collapse. There are others who survive through the long term. For example, this company, Stora. Now, you may never have heard of them, but they're still pretty big in wind power and in paper and related products. It's a Scandinavian company which actually goes back to the 13th century. So we're talking nearly 800 years of survival. Not by doing the same thing, but by innovating. Or these people. Merck, a German company, originally a pharmacy founded 350 years ago. And today they're still involved in pharmaceuticals, but many other things. In fact, the product you probably are most familiar with is the liquid crystal display in the screen you're looking at. It's a good chance that's been made by Merck. This one is a relative youngster compared to the other two. 3M is only 100 years old, but the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company, to give it its proper name, is another that survived in the long term. Or the Marshall Group, established 100 years ago, 1909, still around and doing well, with a history in the aerospace and motor industry of continuous innovation. Or Hella, another name you've probably never heard of, but very good chance the headlights on any car you're likely to drive will have been made by Hella. Hella's not just about car headlights or lighting, it's one of the power players in car electronics, so much a feature of the new generation of thinking about autonomous driving and even driverless cars. So these are companies which have survived, but they've done so through consistent innovation. They're smart. They've learned a lot. They've built their competencies. One of the things, for example, about 3M is its deep roots into knowledge that it needs to coat surfaces. Its origins, the Minnesota mining and manufacturing company, were to do with making sandpaper, coating small pieces of rock onto paper so they could be used at that time in the emerging car industry. But there's another thing about companies like 3M. Not just that they've acquired a knowledge base, but they're flexible in their approach to what they do. They're prepared to change themselves. In the case of 3M, this was a survival issue. The mining part of the Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing Company bought a mine to dig out carborundum, the grit for their sandpaper. Unfortunately, it was the wrong kind of mineral, and the company nearly failed before it had got started. Or Philips, originally a light bulb maker. That's where the company began about 100 years ago. But it's not a long jump from light bulbs to taking the air out of them, making a vacuum, and doing things with the electrodes inside. That's the basis of electronics, way back at the turn of the last century. Today it's still involved in lighting, but it's got a big presence in fields like medical electronics. And it's got there again through this consistent process of innovation, changing what they offer the world, and particularly drawing, like 3M, on a deep knowledge base. Or Procter & Gamble. We've already seen they're another key player today, even though they're nearly 200 years old. And their thousands of products, once again, draw on a deep knowledge base. They spend about $3 billion a year doing research, and even more on the market side. So, all these companies haven't done one thing and then stuck to it. They've innovated and innovated and innovated. So it's worth looking at these and indeed other members of the 100 Club, companies that have survived 100 years or more. What's their recipe for innovation success? Well, several things come to mind. The first is a commitment to innovation, a vision, a view of the future which sees changing what we offer the world and how we create and deliver that as a core part of the business. It's also about innovating in multiple directions. It's not just product, it's processes, it's services, it's working with new markets, it's innovating in many different directions. And it's about building a deep knowledge base. A phrase we might use is, you grow through what you know. One other thing they're all prepared to do is to change and to challenge the underlying models of how they innovate. Procter & Gamble, for example, nearly 200 years old, very successful history of research-based innovation, creating new knowledge and diffusing that. But they weren't afraid to say at the turn of the 21st century that in a world where there is so much knowledge out there, we probably need to change our approach. And they changed the model to what they called connect and develop. The idea was simple. In the future, we're going to get half the ideas for the innovations we need from outside the company. When they said that, they'd no idea how, so they've spent the last 20 years or so revising and rebuilding the organization's approach to innovation. That's the kind of adaptability that Charles Darwin would be proud of. Now, we've talked a lot about companies, but it's exactly the same thing in the public sector and in the world of social innovation. For the Red Cross, it's another 100 Club member. It's been around quite a long time, but it's continuing to innovate in what it does and in the ways it thinks about innovation. MindLab, an organisation set up in Denmark, originally owned and run by the Ministry of Taxation, not normally the place you'd associate with high levels of innovation. But alongside partners in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and the Ministry of Employment, MindLab essentially began to challenge and help the way in which Danish public policy found its way into practice in terms of innovations in products and services. Its job was to stimulate innovation. But just like Procter & Gamble, recently a revision of their very successful approach has led to a different model. MindLab has been closed or has morphed into a new approach, more digitally focused, still embedded heavily in the government, still trying to drive successful public sector innovation. And we've seen organisations like the Aravind Eye Clinics, essentially something set up in the 1970s, but it didn't stand still after its original setup. It's grown, changing what it offers the world, but particularly also rethinking many of the ways in which it creates and delivers that. So, let's summarize. Innovation is essential. It's an imperative. Survival is not guaranteed in a constantly changing environment. Even large companies fail, even large companies with successful history of innovation. And of course, for startups, it's a much more tricky landscape. So just saying we believe in innovation isn't enough. We've got to work at it, but in particular, we have to take Charles Darwin's prescription on board. We have to adapt not only what we offer, but also the ways in which we think about innovation. And the recipe for success includes things like having the vision and commitment for innovation over the long term, being prepared to innovate in multiple directions and to change that portfolio, and most importantly, being prepared to change the underlying model for how we think about and mobilize innovation.